Picture this. It's 3 in the morning. Total darkness. You snap awake, not to a rooster, not to a trumpet, but to the sound of men screaming as they drown. You stagger out of your tent, half drunk, reaching for a sword that isn't there. The camp is in chaos. 70,000 soldiers are running, shouting, trampling each other into the mud. You scan the horizon, expecting to see thousands of enemy torches lighting up the night. But there's nothing. No lines, no banners, no army, just shadows sliding through tall grass, flashes of steel under the moon, and the horrifying realization that your massive army isn't fighting a battle. It's being slaughtered in its sleep. This is the Battle of Maritsa, the night when 800 men annihilated 70,000 and changed the map of Europe forever. Before we dive into this forgotten nightmare of arrogance and survival, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, hit that like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. I love knowing that we're piecing together these ancient stories across continents and centuries, connected by the same curiosity. Now let's cut through the fog of war and look at the hard facts. September 26th, 1371. The banks of the Maritsa River. This wasn't a battle. It was a crime scene. On one side stood the Serbian Empire. King Vukašin and his brother Uglješa had assembled a coalition so massive it effectively drained the Balkans of its military manpower. 70,000 men. To put that into perspective, Henry IV won the Battle of Agincourt with around 6,000 troops. This Serbian force was a medieval juggernaut. They were marching on Adrianople, intent on crushing the Ottoman presence in Europe once and for all. They were heavily armored, richly supplied, and dangerously confident. On the other side was Lala Shahin Pasha, the Ottoman garrison commander. He had 800 men, not 8,000, 800. On paper, the odds were nearly 90-1, but numbers don't win battles. Discipline does. And discipline was exactly what the Serbian army lacked. As the sun set on September 25th, the Serbian commanders made a decision historians still struggle to explain. They camped within striking distance of the enemy and threw a party. This wasn't a tactical bivouac. It was a celebration. So convinced were they that the Ottomans would flee from their sheer size that they abandoned basic military protocol. No trenches, no palisades, and in a move that bordered on suicidal arrogance, no sentries. Think about that. The largest army in Christendom was sleeping in enemy territory, and not a single pair of eyes was watching the perimeter. Men unbuckled their plate armor. Shields were stacked in wagons. Wine casks were smashed open. Soldiers drank until they collapsed in the grass. Laughter and singing echoed through the hills, broadcasting their location for miles. They were a blind, deaf, drunken giant, and the wolf was watching. Lala Shahin Pasha didn't panic when scouts reported the massive army. He didn't retreat to Adrianople. He rode out to meet them, with his 800 Akinis. These weren't standard infantry. They were irregular light cavalry, the shock troops of the early Ottoman state. Fast, silent, ruthless. While Serbian soldiers toasted their inevitable victory, Shahin Pasha studied them from the darkness. He saw the unguarded camp, the dying fires, the singing fade into snores. He understood something crucial. The 70,000 men before him were no longer soldiers. They were livestock. He divided his tiny force into 2 detachments and ordered their horses' hooves muffled. No torches, no battle cries. They crept forward like a tightening noose. The goal wasn't to fight, it was to terrify. Shahin Pasha knew that if the Serbians formed a line, his men would be wiped out in minutes. But if he shattered their minds before touching their bodies, the numbers wouldn't matter. He waited for the deepest hour of the night, when sleep is heaviest and the mind slowest. The moment when confusion reigns supreme. The giant was about to wake, not with a kiss, but with a dagger. To understand how 70,000 men could be this catastrophically careless, we have to talk about the ghost haunting their camp. Stefan Dušan, remembered as Dušan the Mighty. Just 20 years earlier, he had forged the Serbian Empire into the dominant power of the Balkans. He crushed the Byzantine Empire and dreamed of ruling from Constantinople itself. Under his rule, the army was a machine, disciplined, centralized, lethal, but empires built by strong men often share a fatal flaw. They fracture the moment the strong man dies. When Dušan died suddenly in 1355, the throne passed to his son Stefan Uroš V, known to history with brutal honesty as Uroš the Weak. The empire didn't slowly decline. It exploded into feudal anarchy. Central authority vanished. Regional lords became petty kings, fighting each other for scraps, while a far greater threat gathered to the east. Enter the architects of disaster, King Vukašin and his brother Uglješa. They weren't fools. They were capable warriors and savvy politicians who carved out semi-independent realms in Macedonia. They were the strongest men left standing amid the wreckage of Dušan's dream. But their strength was also their weakness. They were used to fighting other Christian lords in ritualized European warfare, daylight battles, ransom-taking, heavy cavalry charges. The army they assembled at Maritsa reflected this fractured reality. It wasn't a unified force. It was a bloated coalition stitched together from dozens of noble retinues, mercenaries, and reluctant levies. In such an army, command is a suggestion, not a law. Every minor lord thinks he's a general. Every unit answers to someone else. That's why no one posted sentries. In a centralized army, one order gets trenches dug. In a feudal coalition, everyone assumes someone else is handling it. Pride kept the nobles from ordering knights to dig. Drunkenness kept the mercenaries from caring. They believed their sheer mass would frighten the Ottomans into submission. They saw them not as a disciplined military state, but as nomadic raiders to be swatted aside. They didn't realize that while they were playing feudal politics, the Ottomans were turning warfare into a science. The Serbian Empire was a glass cannon, massive, terrifying, and brittle. All it would take was one precise strike to shatter it, and that strike was already waiting in the tall grass. While the Serbian coalition was a relic of the past, the force lurking in the shadows represented the future of warfare. To understand why 800 men didn't run from 70,000, you have to understand exactly who those 800 men were. They were not conscripted peasants gripping rusty spears. They were Akinis. In Ottoman military culture, the Akinis were raiders, the tip of the spear. They received no salary from the Sultan. Instead, they lived entirely off what they could plunder. That system forged a very specific kind of warrior, hungry, aggressive, and relentlessly mobile. While Serbian knights were weighed down by 60 pounds of plate armor and rode massive war horses bred for straight-line charges, the Akinis wore light armor, leather or chain, and rode nimble, tireless horses that could move through forests, rivers, and broken terrain at terrifying speed. Their weapons weren't just physical, they were psychological. The Akinis were masters of asymmetric warfare. Their role wasn't to hold ground, it was to spread fear. They carried composite bows capable of punching through armor from a distance, and curved scimitars designed for slashing attacks from horseback. They fought in loose formations, swarming enemies like hornets instead of crashing into them like a wall. And leading them was Lala Shahin Pasha. He wasn't just a battlefield commander. He was the Beylerbey of Rumelia, the highest-ranking Ottoman official in Europe. He was also the Sultan's tutor. He understood something critical. In a fair fight, he would lose. But Ottoman doctrine didn't care about fair. It cared about winning. Even at this early stage, the Ottomans were building a professional military culture that valued discipline over individual glory. The Serbians were playing chess. Lala Shahin was playing poker. He looked at his 800 men and didn't see a suicide squad. He saw a precision instrument. He knew that 70,000 men packed together, drunk and disorganized, weren't an army. They were a mob. And mobs are vulnerable to one thing above all else: panic. The Akinis were also Ghazis, warriors of the faith. That belief gave them a morale edge the bickering Christian coalition simply didn't have. Serbian soldiers were there because their lords ordered them to be. The Akinis believed it was their destiny to expand the abode of Islam. That fanaticism, combined with the reality that retreat wasn't an option, made them the most dangerous fighters imaginable. Men with nothing to lose. As the moon climbed over the Maritsa, the Akinis checked their girths and loosened their blades. They knew the terrain. They knew the enemy's position. And thanks to Serbian negligence, they knew exactly when to strike. The wolf wasn't just at the door. The wolf was already inside the house, and the sheep were still asleep. Just past midnight, the Serbian camp finally fell silent. The laughter died. The songs faded. All that remained was the low, rhythmic rumble of snores. This was the moment Lala Shahin Pasha had been waiting for. He gathered his commanders in the dark woods and issued orders that would echo through military history. He knew he couldn't simply ride in swinging swords. If the Serbians realized they were facing only 800 men, they'd rally and crush them. The goal was illusion. He needed 70,000 men to believe they were surrounded by an army twice their size. First came stealth. The Akinis dismounted and tore strips of cloth from their tunics and saddlebags, wrapping them tightly around their horses' iron shoes. It was an old trick, rarely used at this scale. 800 horses, normally a rolling thunder, became ghosts. They moved through the underbrush almost silently. Next came deployment. Shahin Pasha didn't keep his force together. He spread them thin, forming a wide, loose circle around the Serbian camp, like a noose tightening around a neck. When the attack began, the sound wouldn't come from one direction. It would come from everywhere: north, south, east, west. To a half-awake, wine-soaked soldier, it would feel like the horizon itself was attacking. Finally, the weapons of psychological warfare. Every Akini carried 2 unlit torches. They had drums, they had trumpets, and they had their voices. Shahin Pasha ordered them to wait for his signal. The plan was a gamble bordering on madness. If even one Serbian sentry had been awake, if a single soldier had wandered into the woods and spotted them, surprise would vanish, and the Akinis would be massacred. But the forest stayed silent. The Serbians slept on, cocooned in arrogance. The Akinis crept closer. 50 yards, 30, 20. They could smell the stale wine and cold wood smoke. They could see faces inside tents, men who would never wake up again. Every snapped twig sounded like a cannon in their ears. Still, the giant didn't stir. Lala Shahin Pasha drew his scimitar. He glanced at the moon, then at his men. The trap was set. The elephant was asleep. The wolf was at its throat. He nodded, and then he gave the order that turned the Maritsa into a graveyard. The silence didn't break with a whisper. It exploded. 800 drums began beating in perfect unison, a thunderous rhythm meant to mimic the march of a massive infantry army. At the same instant, hundreds of trumpets screamed into the night. Torches flared to life, 2 per man. The Achaeans rode in frantic, overlapping circles. From inside the Serbian camp, the effect was apocalyptic. One moment there was pure darkness. The next, the entire perimeter was ringed with fire. The swirling lights made it impossible to count attackers. It looked like an endless sea of flame, hell itself closing in. To the drunken, groggy Serbian soldiers, this wasn't a raid. It was the entire Ottoman host. It was the Sultan descending upon them with divine wrath. And panic, true panic, is contagious. Men burst from tents, tripping over guy ropes and discarded armor. Whatever command structure existed evaporated instantly. No orders, no formations, just screams. "The Turks are here! We're surrounded! Run!" Then the arrows began to fall. The Achaeans didn't aim at individuals. They didn't need to. The target was a city of tents. Arrows tore through canvas, struck horses, punched into unarmored backs. The goal wasn't precision, it was chaos. But the true genius of the attack wasn't what the Ottomans did. It was what the Serbians did to themselves. In the confusion, shadows became monsters. A half-armored knight would see a figure rushing toward him and strike without hesitation. No heraldry, no recognition. Brother killed brother. Ally killed ally. The camp dissolved into a frenzy of fratricide. The Ottomans stayed on the edges, circling like wolves, herding the mass inward while the sheep tore each other apart. Fire spread through the tents. Horses screamed, men begged. The noise swallowed all reason. Some soldiers tried to mount horses, only to be dragged down by their own comrades. Others ran blindly toward the river, choosing darkness and water over flame and steel. Lala Shahin Pasha watched calmly. He didn't need to throw his men into the grinder. He simply kept the pressure on the perimeter, letting the Serbian army destroy itself. It was military jiu-jitsu, using the enemy's size and strength against them. 70,000 men had marched to conquer Adrianople. Now they were fighting for their lives against an enemy that barely existed, and they were losing. As the phantom encirclement tightened, the mass of 70,000 men began to move like water under pressure. It surged toward the path of least resistance. That path led straight to the Maritsa River. In the darkness, the river looked like salvation, a black ribbon promising escape, a barrier between terrified men and the demons circling in the woods. Thousands ran for it without hesitation. They forgot the physics of their own profession. These were heavy infantry and knights. They wore chainmail, gambesons, and plate armor. A fully equipped man-at-arms carried 40 to 60 pounds of steel. On land, it made him unstoppable. In water, it made him an anchor. The first wave leapt in and sank almost instantly, dragged down by the weight of their armor. They didn't just drown, they were crushed. The second wave plunged in on top of them, trampling bodies already struggling beneath the surface. The riverbed became a choking layer of men clawing at mud and flesh. Panic erased humanity. Men climbed onto the backs of their comrades, forcing them under to steal a breath of air. The Maritsa, normally slow and wide, began to churn violently. It was no longer water. It was mud, blood, steel, and screaming. Somewhere in that chaos were King Vukašin and his brother Ugliesha. The men who dreamed of crushing the Ottomans and marching on Constantinople were now just two more figures in a stampede. History is deliberately vague about how they died, And that may be the cruelest detail of all. There was no heroic last stand. No duel with Lala Shahin Pasha. Some accounts say they were swept away by the current, their royal armor pulling them to the bottom where they drowned anonymously among peasants. Other, darker sources suggest they were killed by their own men, desperate soldiers tearing gold chains from their necks or stealing horses to escape. However it happened, the result was the same. The leaders vanished into the river. No bodies, no funerals, no legacy. As dawn crept over the banks of the Maritsa, the Ottomans ended their pursuit. They didn't need to chase anyone. The river had done their work. Turkish chroniclers later gave the site a name that still feels obscene to say aloud: the Serbian destruction. They wrote that the river was so clogged with corpses that horses could cross on a bridge of bodies. That may be poetic exaggeration, but the reality was horrifying enough. Thousands died by the sword. Tens of thousands died by panic. The army didn't retreat. It evaporated. In a single night, the military backbone of the Christian Balkans snapped. The men who marched out with the arrogance of conquerors were now drifting downstream toward the Aegean Sea. The gates of Europe stood open. When the sun finally rose on September 27th, it didn't just illuminate a battlefield. It exposed a lie. Surviving Serbian soldiers who hid in the woods expected to see an endless sea of Ottoman troops. Instead, they saw a handful of exhausted men picking through the wreckage of the greatest army the Balkans had ever assembled. For Lala Shahin Pasha and his 800 Akinis, the scene was surreal. Tables still set for feasts lay overturned, wine soaked into blood-stained grass, gold goblets, jeweled swords, silk tents, and chests of silver lay abandoned in the mud. Generations of Serbian wealth were scattered like trash, but the river was the most shocking sight of all. Chroniclers describe it as clogged with wagons, horses, and bodies, the current visibly slowed by debris. It was total devastation. That morning marked a psychological rupture in the Balkans. Until then, Christian kingdoms viewed the Ottomans as a temporary nuisance, raiders who would eventually be pushed back into Asia. After Maritsa, denial turned into dread. The invincible Serbian Empire, the successor to Rome in the region, had been decapitated by a force that wasn't even a formal army. Lala Shahin Pasha didn't just win a battle. He shattered a myth. He proved that heavy feudal warfare was obsolete against speed, discipline, and terror. His message echoed from Constantinople to Vienna. Your walls will not save you. Your numbers mean nothing. You are not safe. The Akinis loaded their saddlebags with gold, but they left behind the heaviest prize of all: fear. Fear travels faster than any horse. Back in the Serbian heartland, silence followed. No kings returned, no army regrouped, only a vacuum remained. And in geopolitics, vacuums are filled quickly. The tragedy of Maritsa wasn't just the death of 70,000 men. It was what their deaths made inevitable. The Ottomans poured through the breach like water through a broken dam. Cities across Macedonia and Thrace fell within months, often without resistance. Terrified by stories of the river, towns surrendered at the first sight of Ottoman banners. Adrianople, the city Vukašin marched to liberate, soon became Edirne, the new Ottoman capital. Let that sink in. An Islamic empire didn't just raid Europe, it moved its capital there. The Ottomans weren't visiting, they were staying. Christian rulers faced a grim choice: fight and be annihilated, or bend the knee. Most bent. The age of vassal states began. Kings paid tribute, sent sons as hostages, supplied troops for Ottoman campaigns. Christian soldiers now marched alongside the army that had destroyed them. The Balkans became fuel for their own conquest. And nowhere is the human cost clearer than in the story of Prince Marko. In folklore, Marko Kraljevic is a giant, a wine-drinking, monster-slaying hero who defies the Turks. But legends are born when reality is unbearable. The real Marko was the son of King Vukašin. After Maritsa, he inherited a crown without an army, lands without defenses, and people on the brink of extinction. To save them, he did the unthinkable. He bent the knee. Marko became an Ottoman vassal, forced to fight for the empire that killed his father. He marched against other Christians, against his own people. In 1395, at the Battle of Rovine, Marko fought for the Ottoman Sultan against a Christian army. Legend claims he prayed for the Christians to win, even if it meant his own death. He did die there, fighting for his enemy, against his faith, trapped by consequences born on a drunken night in 1371. The Battle of Maritsa didn't just kill men, it killed futures. It turned kings into servants and heroes into myths because reality was too cruel to remember. It reminds us that power without discipline is just weight. That size without vigilance is weakness. A giant asleep is weaker than a dwarf who is awake. The Serbian Empire didn't fall because the Ottomans were stronger. It fell because it stopped paying attention. So remember the Maritsa River. Remember the silence before the drums. Remember that history doesn't care how big you are. It only cares how awake you are.